You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Google Gemini. With the Gemini app, you can talk live and have a real-time conversation with an AI assistant. It's great for all kinds of things, like if you want to practice for an upcoming interview, ask for advice on things to do in a new city, or brainstorm creative ideas. And by the way, this script was actually read by Gemini. Download the Gemini app for iOS and Android today. Must be 18 plus to use Gemini Live.
70,000 people are here, and Bob Dylan is the reason for it.
Inspired by the true story.
For anyone who's gonna hold your attention on stage, you have to kind of be a freak.
Are you a freak?
Hope so.
And starring Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He defied everyone.
Turn it down!
Play loud!
To change everything.
Make some noise, BD.
Timothée Chalamet, Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro, a complete unknown. Now playing only in theaters. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 205, The Fall of France, Surrender. This week, a big thank you goes out to Christopher and J.A. for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. After the fall of the Reynaud government on June 16, 1940, in favor of one led by Petain and Petain, the fighting in France was on the clock, and the start of armistice negotiations was really only a matter of time. This was not just due to political reasons, but also the continued deterioration of the situation at the front, with some of the German divisions hitting distance records for a single day of advance during the middle days of June, including a staggering 240-kilometer advance by Rommel and his 7th Panzer Division on June 17th. They would eventually reach Cherbourg on June 19th. Also on June 17th, on the complete opposite side of France, Guderian reached the border with Switzerland after advancing from the north. While these gains were impressive, by this point the French army was firmly in the mode of retreating as quickly as it possibly could, putting forth little actual resistance. This meant that major advances by the Germans were expected by both sides. Before Reynaud was forced to resign from his position of prime minister, he made one final, very important decision that would have a long-lasting impact on the overall course of the history of France. On June 14th, the French government was on its way to its third home of the war in Bordeaux, putting more space between itself and the German divisions moving west. At this point, Reynaud fully intended to continue the war, and would send a telegram to Roosevelt in America asking for assistance, although the belief was that actually receiving meaningful help from the Americans at this point would be very unlikely. Instead, according to later accounts, what Reynaud was doing here is sending this telegram mostly for the future records of French actions during the war. Really, he was just trying to get it in the logbook for future history books, or podcasts, I guess. I've fallen into the trap. When the government reached Bordeaux, Reynaud would meet with Charles de Gaulle, who was at this time the deputy chief of staff of the French army, with de Gaulle being informed that Reynaud intended to continue the war from North Africa, and therefore de Gaulle was being sent to London to ensure that British assistance was properly arranged for and organized. The fact that de Gaulle was given this assignment, and was therefore out of France when the armistice negotiations began, was a critical part of the foundation and justification for the Free French movement which de Gaulle would lead for the remainder of the war. Because he wanted to continue fighting in northern Africa, Reynaud would meet with Petain and request that he ask the Germans for an immediate ceasefire in France, with the idea that the forces that still remained in France would be surrendered, but that Reynaud and the other French ministers would be able to form a government in exile. This would be very similar to what had already happened for the Norwegian and Dutch and Polish governments, all of which had went into exile in Britain and surrendered their armed forces that were still in the country. However, Petain refused, with one of the reasons being that he and his associates would lose all of their influence within the French government if he went forward with the plan. Petain would be left behind in France to surrender the army and himself to the Germans, and then Reynaud would probably replace all of those ministers that supported an armistice within his government, with those who favored an armistice with the Germans being replaced with those who wanted to continue the war. Petain simply did not want this to happen, and so he refused to play his part. And by this point, enough of the other ministers within the government had come to Petain's side that there was little that Reynaud could really do to push forward against such opposition, even from those outside of the government who saw a path to power through Petain. These were men like Pierre Laval, who would be a critical member of the Vichy government and who was already kind of positioning himself to take that role. This amalgamation of resistance to Reynaud's choice of resistance in North Africa would cause him to consider a threat to resign on June 15th after losing a vote in the cabinet. But he did not sort of pursue this course of action at this point. A threat to resign is something where often the person who's doing it wants it to be a threat, but not to actually resign. And Reynaud at this point, by June 15th, was concerned that they would just accept it, put Petain in his place, and then move forward. Due to the amount of thought that Reynaud put into that decision, to that threat to resign, and kind of where we're kind of at in our series on the invasion of France, I think it's worth taking just a moment to discuss what might have happened in two different cases from this point, from this like June 15th, June 16th point. One of which was if the French government had moved to North Africa, and then the other was the somewhat famous offer of union that was discussed at least briefly on the British and French sides, although it wouldn't end up happening. So let's dig into both of those situations. Now, Reynaud's argument about continuing the French resistance from North Africa did have some merit, and unlike the governments in exile from some of those other nations, the French government would be exiling itself from France, but not from French-controlled territory, which they had a lot of in North Africa. And there was also a serious amount of French military manpower that could be sourced from these areas. And that was one of the things that the French planned to do in a long war, was to bring a lot of soldiers from North Africa. So they were there. The goal was to begin transferring troops to North Africa as well by June 20th at the earliest. Once these transfers started, the goal was to move troops as quickly as possible, because it would take about 6 days for troops to be loaded from ports in southern France and then move to North African ports and then get off of their transports. If a new defensive line could be formed around the southern French ports, with the French army retreating as quickly as possible, a significant number of men and materiel could be expected to make it to North Africa from those southern French ports, and every single day would see more men and equipment moved. There were also a good number of aircraft that were making this trip every single day. By the middle of June, around 30 to 50 planes per day were rolling out of factories in southern France, and they were immediately making the trip to Africa. More importantly, for both the future of France and the overall war against Germany, was the presence of the French fleet in the Mediterranean. When Italy entered the war, the French Navy was roughly equivalent, to the Italian Navy, which meant that the French Navy, combined with the British naval resources in the Mediterranean, would have given them complete superiority over movement within the Mediterranean Sea. This would have completely changed the course of the war, even if the French might have had some challenges keeping all of their navy at sea and supplied. Now, the presence of the French Navy and the active participation of the French Navy was Italy's greatest fear, but the greatest fear of the Germans was simply prolonging the war against France. It was likely that the German army would have needed a few additional weeks, maybe another month, to finally capture the rest of France, just due to distance and time, and they would have had to deal with whatever the French decided to do afterwards. In the short term, this would not have caused a German defeat. France was defeated. We're talking about a matter of time. But it would simply require more resources, more men, and more time, which would prevent the German military from doing anything else, like turning its eyes against Britain, which was always the plan for after France was defeated. Speaking of Britain, another topic that would be discussed was an offer of union by the British to the French. The origin point for this idea was probably on June 14th, when a memorandum was sent to the War Cabinet that suggested that the UK and France could be brought closer together, even closer than their current military alliance, through the joining of the two governments. This would cause a common citizenship. There would be joint bodies for defense, foreign policy, and economics. However, both nations would retain their separate parliaments. The report from June 14th, written by the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amory, would state that the best hope for victory over Germany lay in, quote, the real, complete, immediate, and enduring unity of the two countries, acting as one without regard to separate interests, and the dramatic and spectacular expression of this unity in action, in speech, in informal assembly, and ceremonial, end quote. When Churchill was first informed, he would write the quote, "I was somewhat surprised to see this staid, stolid, experienced politicians of all parties engage themselves so passionately in an immense design whose implications and consequences were in no way thought out. I did not resist, but yielded easily to these generous surges, which carried out resolves to a very high level of unselfish and undaunted action." End quote. De Gaulle, who was in London at this time, thought that this was a fantastic idea and was probably the best path forward for France. On June 16th, as the idea was still being formulated, he would speak with Reynaud on the phone, saying, quote, "I've just seen Churchill. There is something stupendous in preparation affecting the entity of the two countries. Churchill proposes the establishment of a single Franco-British government, with you, perhaps, Mr. President, as head of the Franco-British War Cabinet." End quote. The initial note led to further discussions and further drafts around the concept, with it being agreed that a formal note should be written and dispatched to the French government as quickly as possible. When de Gaulle had a conversation with Reynaud, this effort became more urgent because Reynaud said that it was critical that any type of proposal be provided as quickly as possible, otherwise he might not even be in position to try and make it happen. De Gaulle and several British ministers would then get together and draft the final note that would be dispatched, which I will read here in full. Quote, "At this most fateful moment in the history of the modern world, the governments of the United Kingdom and the French Republic make this declaration of indissoluble union, an unyielding resolution in their common defense of justice and freedom against subjection to a system which reduces mankind to a life of robots and slaves. The two governments declare that France and Great Britain shall no longer be two nations, but one Franco-British Union. The Constitution of the Union will provide for joint organs of defense, foreign, financial, and economic policies. Every citizen of France will enjoy immediate citizenship of Great Britain. Every British subject will become a citizen of France. Both countries will share responsibility for the repair of the devastation of war wherever it occurs in their territories, and the resources of both shall be equally and as one applied to that purpose. During the war, there shall be a single war cabinet, and all the forces of Britain and France, whether on land, sea, or in the air, shall be placed under its direction. It will govern from wherever best it can. The two parliaments will be formally associated. The nations of the British Empire are already forming new armies. France will keep her available forces in the field, on the sea, and in the air. The Union appeals to the United States to fortify the economic resources of the Allies and to bring her powerful material aid to the common cause. The Union will concentrate its whole energy against the power of the enemy, no matter where the battle may be, and thus we shall conquer." End quote. Now, while the offer of union was certainly an imaginative idea, and contained within it some of the same ideas that would eventually go on to form the foundation of the European Union, it was a wartime expediency. It was bound to cause problems. Churchill had it right, that while it was a surprising and sort of bold proposition, the long-term consequences were not in any way thought out. Instead, the British were just concerned with keeping France in the war and beating Germany, and assumed that they could just deal with whatever happened later.
What if you could hear your favorite song for the first time again? Introducing the all-new, reimagined Nissan Kicks. With an available Bose Personal Plus sound system that uses speakers in the headrest to create a 360-degree listening experience. You've never heard anything like this. Reimagine your music and your drive. Experience the all-new, reimagined Nissan Kicks for yourself at nissanusa.com today.
Available feature. Bose is a registered trademark of the Bose Corporation.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
When he presented this idea of an active union with the British to the cabinet, it would be the third in a series of defeats for Reynaud over the course of June 15th and 16th. The cascade of failure would start with Roosevelt's response to the French letter of the previous day, in which Reynaud had asked for the Americans' assistance. The answer was firmly in the negative, as expected, with Roosevelt being very noncommittal about any real aid, which was really demanded by the views of many in the American government that were firmly set against any kind of intervention by the Americans. The second major setback was a response from Churchill to the question of whether or not the British would release the French from one of the clauses of their alliance, the one dealing with negotiating a separate peace. As with many military alliances, the British and French had included a clause that when they entered a war against a common enemy, neither side could negotiate a separate peace with that enemy. Given their situation, the French ministers who were pushing for an armistice wanted London to release them from this part of their agreement so that they could pursue discussions with Germany. When this request was dispatched to the British government, Reynaud fully expected and was kind of hoping for a rejection from the British leaders, but instead, the response was a permissive one. There was only one caveat attached to such permission, and that was that the French fleet needed to be moved to British ports to prevent it from falling into German hands. The presentation of the proposition of union then landed like a damp squib, with the French ministers being split. Those that supported the continuation of the war saw it as a lifeline, just like de Gaulle did. Those that were already pushing for an armistice simply saw it as a way for the British to take control of France and to rob the French of their colonies. Basically, they viewed the entire idea with distrust and simply a way for the British to continue to profit from the suffering of the French. In the end, the concept was not even put up to a vote before the cabinet. This just wasn't going to happen. But what was voted on was the topic of beginning armistice negotiations with Germany. This vote would finally cause Reynaud to see the hopelessness of his situation and to kind of give up, and he would choose to resign. The resignation of Reynaud was probably inevitable after the continuation of France's military defeats during June, and he would be replaced by the man that everybody expected to replace him, Petain. The process of negotiating the armistice began basically immediately, with the French sending a message to Spain for the Spanish government to forward to Germany. Then just after noon on June 17th, Petain would speak to the French nation on the radio, during which he would say, quote, "With a heavy heart, I tell you today that it is necessary to stop the fighting," end quote. Now, while this was not the end of the fighting, it was certainly the end of any real organization for the French army, even though it would not be until June 19th that the German response to the French request for negotiations would arrive. As with the French, the Germans would go through the Spanish to deliver their message, and that they were open to begin negotiations. Then late on June 20th, the French delegation would cross the lines. This delegation was led by General Hunsinger, the same man in charge of the defenses around Sedan that had been so critical to the overall course of the campaign. Negotiations is probably the wrong word for what followed, and instead the Germans simply dictated the 24 articles of the treaty that would be signed, which Hunsinger would then relay to the French government in Bordeaux. We do not need to go through every article of the treaty, but 5 of them stand out in terms of the overall impact for kind of our story and for the story of the Second World War. The first article required that the French end all hostilities with Germany, I guess the basic requirement for an armistice, basically. The second article revolved around drawing lines between the areas of northern France, which would be occupied by Germany, and those of southern France, which would not be occupied. The fifth banned further French armament production and the surrendering of all intact military equipment. Article 8 then required the French fleet to surrender itself to German and Italian ports, and then Article 18 specified that the French government would be financially responsible for all German occupation activities. While the French ministers were hoping to actually be able to negotiate with the Germans, it was clear that that really wasn't going to happen in any meaningful way, and their only option was to accept. But before that happened, Admiral Darlan did order that every seaworthy ship of the French fleet be put to sea, and that it head for North African or British ports. While Darlan agreed with the need for an armistice, he had no desire to see the French ships used by the Germans, even if the Germans were giving their assurances that they would not be used in the war against Britain. Of course they wouldn't. We'll just leave those ships sitting there. We won't touch them. Darlan did not trust these promises. With it clear that the only option was to accept German demands, on the evening of June 22nd, Hunsinger was given permission to sign to the terms, and the shooting would end at 12:35 a.m. on June 25th. The fighting was over. For the Germans, the armistice with France achieved many different objectives, particularly as it related to France's ally, Great Britain. The first was that it left Germany in control of the entire coast of northern and western France, which provided Germany with direct access to both the English Channel and to the Atlantic Ocean. These positions would be critical if the war continued because it would allow for more direct attacks against the British home islands, as well as better access to shipping lanes of the Atlantic. The second and most obvious is that it ended resistance from the French military, which was of course great for the Germans because it allowed the German army to begin to rest and refit for either the invasion of Britain or whatever else the future may hold. The third and perhaps less obvious was that it provided a template and an example for what the British might expect when it came to negotiations with Germany. While allowing the French to maintain control of southern France and its colonies allowed the Germans to gain French acceptance faster and prevented further fighting, it would also make it clear to British leaders that a rather lenient peace was possible with Germany. Germany could point to the French armistice as an example that they would allow the British to maintain control of their islands and their imperial possessions around the world, and so they should, work with Germany as quickly as possible. Of course, this would not work out quite as the Germans hoped, and the British would not come to the negotiating table, either when France surrendered or in the months that followed. Also, the overall course of France within the war and the French war effort would not go in the way that the Germans hoped. An important part of the difference between the actions that the French would take and that the Germans wanted them to take would be around the actions of Charles de Gaulle. When it became clear that Petain would be coming to power, de Gaulle would arrange for a flight out of Bordeaux and back to Britain. He would also find space for his family on one of the last civilian ships to leave Brest. Once in London, he would begin to work directly with the British government to build support among Frenchmen both in France and around the world to build what would become Free France. De Gaulle wanted to use the BBC for this purpose, to make a verbal appeal over the radio, something that some within the British war cabinet were concerned would do nothing but anger Petain and the French government that remained in southern France. But eventually, de Gaulle would be allowed to make his appeal, which would come to be known as the Appeal of 18 June. And I'm going to read a full text of that speech, translated into English, obviously, as a good way, I think, to close out this episode. So here it is from Charles de Gaulle, the Appeal of 18 June. The leaders who, for many years, were at the head of French armies have formed a government. This government, alleging our armies to be undone, agreed with the enemy to stop fighting. Of course, we were subdued by the mechanical ground and air forces of the enemy, infinitely more than in their number. It was the tanks, the airplanes, the tactics of the Germans which made us retreat. It was the tanks, the airplanes, the tactics of the Germans that surprised our leaders to the point to bring them there where they are today. But has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final? No. Believe me, I speak to you with full knowledge of the tactics and tell you that nothing is lost for France. The same means that overcame us can bring us to a day of victory. For France is not alone. She is not alone. She is not alone. She has a vast empire behind her. She can align with the British Empire that holds the sea and continues to fight. She can, like England, use without limit the immense industry of the United States. This war is not limited to the unfortunate territory of our country. This war is not finished by the Battle of France. This war is a worldwide war. All the faults, all the delays, all the suffering do not prevent there to be in the world all the necessary means to one day crush our enemies. Vanquished today by mechanical force, we will be able to overcome in the future by a superior mechanical force. The destiny of the world is here. I, General de Gaulle, currently in London, invite the officers and the French soldiers who are located in British territory or who would come there with their weapons or without their weapons. I invite the engineers and the special workers of armament industries who are located in British territory or who would come there to put themselves in contact with me. Whatever happens, the flame of French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished.